Hello, South Africa, and welcome back to the third episode of the DPSA Batupele podcast. I'm Kamogelo Dipoko. In today's episode, we start off a new masterclass on Public Service Commission, constitutional values, and principles. If you haven't already, do take a listen to our two-part masterclass on management practices, OFA, and productivity management. Let's get straight to the business of Public Service Commission, constitutional values, and principles. The masterclass is facilitated by Moses Mushi, the Director of Communications at the DPSA, and led by the Chief Director at the Office of the Public Service Commission, Cameron Jacobs.
The whole aspect of professionalization is linked to Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan, Chapter 13, speaks specifically about building a capable, ethical, and professional public service. And so the national framework towards the professionalization of the public sector is really the articulation and the policy framework, if you will, to Chapter 13 of the National Development Plan. And so there's quite a buzz around the framework, and that we must move towards this systematic process of meritocracy in our public sector, move towards a specific process of developing and creating a cadre of ideal public servants, reviewing induction and the entry requirements, trying to also create a single public service, and we will get to that a little bit later as well. Reviewing policies, reviewing performance management development system, and also trying to resolve the intricacies and the complications around the political administrative interface. And so there's this whole buzzword, I hope that there is, you guys can tell me, around the professionalization of the public service. That was in October 22. In July 2023, the Secretary General of the ANC, and I'll tell you why this becomes important, made a statement that the ANC will remove the Minister of Public Enterprises if there's no improvements at Transnet. But there's something inherently wrong with the statement, isn't it? Because the Secretary General does not have authority to make the statement, as cabinet ministers are appointed by the President and not the party. And so therein lies somewhat the conundrum here, around the confusion of the past 30 years in our democracy about this conflation between party and state. And in some respects, that speaks to the sort of dichotomy and contradiction between, or the contradiction which has led to some of the deficiencies within the public sector. It's become, to a certain extent, less professional and more fundamentally political. But there is no, or put it differently, it's unrealistic to argue, obviously, that there should be no political involvement. In any political system, there is, one way or another, some level of political involvement. And cadre deployment in any political system has a particular space. But when the challenge becomes, when that is that conflation between party and state, and that's when things start to become intensely undemocratic. That's where the space is blurred between the political administrative interface. But our lived reality is something that we cannot ignore in our country. Our lived reality is that there's acute maladministration. There is endemic corruption across the public sector. There's infrastructure collapse, and we all know this, and we all experience this as ordinary citizens in our country. There's pervasive service delivery failures. There are potholes. We're living in stage 6, load shedding at the moment. There are problems with water and sanitation. Our housing deficit is tremendously large. We have currently a disenfranchised citizenry. And we're also the most unequal country in the world, where the top 10% in our country owns about 80% of the wealth. And the bottom 60% accounts for 7% of the wealth in the world. And with all of that, you're sitting with a disempowered, disjointed, and demoralized public service corps. And generally, there is moral decay in our country, from the biggest to the smallest. And that is the lived reality. How do we get to this point in our history? Now, to get to this, to sort of understand this, and we can sort of postulate and come up with certain things that people got to say, for example, corruption, maladministration, lack of enforcement of regulations. But to sort of contextualize this properly and to understand this, and this is where we're going to go to in terms of professionalization. For me, there are sort of two things predominantly. And so when we think about state capture, for example, we often say, state capture happened at some certain point, and before then it was okay, right? It wasn't extensive, it wasn't that bad. What we don't realize that the cracks were there long before. The fissures were there long before. There was this gradual erosion of the past 30 years. And so one of the reasons that have been postulated is because when we started in 1994, we had this sort of mixed approach to public management and public sector reform. It was a time in the global world where sort of new public management became the verb, became fashionable, and there was this push for South Africa to adopt a new public management style or new public management approach. But we come from an apartheid era where, yes, it was racialized, and you had a variety of different administrations, but the apartheid public bureaucracy fundamentally had this sort of Weberian approach to it. It was sort of the traditional approach to public management. And of course, we needed to change that. But what new public management did that we adopted in sort of this sort of subversive way, in a way, because you've got this sort of eclectic mixed approach, is that it weakened centralized control over the administrative apparatus of government. So there was a lot of decentralization and contractualization of service delivery, especially in the procurement and supply chain, right? But we have this mixed approach. We have this sort of traditional Weberian bureaucracy that exists within the public sector, coupled with a sort of new public management decentralization of control. In other words, what I'm trying to put forward here is that at the very beginning, we didn't understand and we didn't develop a public sector paradigm or ideology that was fit for what the country required. We will not be able to achieve the professionalization of the public service without the actualization and internalization of our constitutional values and principles. These are just some cartoons that I put in here, just to give you an indication of where we are. So this one is particularly indicative. It says ethics in this country are going down the tubes. The father says to the son, well, I'm glad it concerns you. And the son says, well, I'm trying to buy a matric maths paper, see, but this crook tries to sell me a fake one. So why the constitutional values and principles, and why is it so important? Well, many of you don't necessarily know that the public service actually has the benefit of a value system that is prescriptive in Section 185. So in the Carmichael judgment, constitutional judgment, and I think, when was Carmichael? 2001. The Constitutional Court said this about our Constitution. It said, our Constitution is not merely a formal document regulating public power. It also embodies, like the German Constitution, an objective normative value system. And Section 185 is exactly that, together with the fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights and the preamble of our Constitution. That's our value system. It's a value system that we need to hold dear. And it's a value system that I said is prescriptive, it's peremptory. In other words, we must adhere to it. If you read Section 185, it says the public administration must adhere to the following values and principles. In other words, we got no choice. And it plays a fundamentally important role in respect of our conduct within the public administration and public service. So we have 9 values and principles: a high standard of professional ethics, efficient, economic and effective use of resources. Public administration must be development orientated. Services must be provided fairly, impartially, and equitably and without bias. People's needs must be responded to. We must be accountable. There must be transparency. There must be good human resource management, and public administration must be broadly representative. But we can't just see this as 9 individual principles. We must see this as a value system. And part of that value system is 2 things, fundamentally: good governance and public servant leadership. So the values and principles direct us to good governance.
Thanks, Mr. Jacobs. Colleagues, we are still open for questions. I see a hand from Mamelo.
Last week at the launch, we had the NSG presenting on the professionalization framework. And the mention of the year 2025, I guess it relates to the work that Mr. Cameron says needs to come into effect, given the two structures that have been put in place. But what we picked up from that presentation is that emphasis is mainly or much on senior management and executive leadership, and not so much on what we at the coal face have to do to try and get on board as speedily as possible. And I'm saying this because one of the issues that is being, or the elements that is reflected, is accountability. And whilst the framework speaks much of getting ready for employment, as well as the competencies, we don't get to hear much of what needs to be done to do away with what one could call undeterred levels of impunity that we see happening in the public service. I'm not sure what is the comment from Mr. Cameron in terms of what is the framework yet to help us in that regard?
Mamelo's question is a very complicated one, and I hear what she is saying. And I think I share to a certain extent, Mamelo, the sort of frustration that you have. When I made a presentation at our retreat around the professionalization framework, I spoke about sort of one of the ironies of the professionalization framework is that we are asked, or the document says that the public service or the public sector is not professionalized. But the very same persons that, or institutions where the finger is pointed, is also asked to professionalize the public service. And the challenge that we face now in terms of this framework is that it was developed by, or drafted initially by, the National School of Government. And then there was this broad stakeholder process that included civil society and included local government and included professional institutions of higher learning as part of the ministerial task team. And it includes the DPSA as well, obviously, and the Public Service Commission. But we also live in this era in the public sector of being compliance driven, right? And so you have all of these stakeholders that, if you look at the professionalization framework as a whole, that have particular responsibilities. So the NSG has a responsibility, the DPSA has a responsibility, the National Planning Commission has a responsibility, the DPME has a responsibility. And we're not operating as a cohesive unit, which is why the Public Service Commission has taken the role of coordinating the implementation of the professionalization framework, and which is why, again, those governance structures of the steering committee and the technical working group become so important. Because even though in terms of the presentation by NSG, there may have been that focus on senior management and executive leadership, that is not where we're going. As I indicated to you, that in terms of the technical working group, we're looking at those particular work streams attached to the 5 pillars. And there will be dedicated individuals to those work streams. And we need to know where to start and where to end, right? Because it has to be a systematic process. But that work has just begun in respect of setting up this technical working group and these particular work streams. But you're right, it's not at the level of senior management and executive leadership. And maybe NSG is focused on that, but I can certainly tell you from my side and from the Public Service Commission side, we are not focused on that. And I do implore upon you to perhaps just be a little bit patient in respect of your question about sort of how do we, deter these sort of levels of impunity as we go along the process of developing this work streams and develop particular action plans to be implemented in respect of the work streams. I hope that there's going to be that multiplier effect, that's going to actually result in just increased level of awareness, increased actualization and internalization, besides sort of the hard work of, around recruitment and selection, right? There is also sort of the whole process of looking at entrance exams or entry exams. There's a whole process of looking at an integrity framework. So if you were to apply for a job, for example, at SIU, part of the application process is this whole long document where they ask you particular questions that they will then evaluate. And that is part of their own process of recruitment in terms of sort of integrity management. And so within that entire process as well, we're looking at developing an integrity framework so that when we start the process of recruitment and selection, we have a similar framework to the SIU, so that you can start screening individuals that may not necessarily be fit for the public service itself. Because once you get somebody in the public service, they may not necessarily be fit for purpose, as you know, and all of us know, it's really difficult through a performance management system as we currently have, to get that person extricated from the public service is incredibly difficult. The question around uniforms. It's a very good question, actually. It's not a question necessarily about uniforms, but it is a question about how we present ourselves. And when I started in a previous life, and I started work outside of the public sector, I was informed that, you wear a shirt and a tie. When I look at the public service, I look at people at the public service, I don't see that uniform dress code that is smart and elegant, that exudes confidence, that exudes authority. And I think that you're absolutely right. Part of professionalization is about our conduct. And part of our conduct is how we dress. And it's something that I will certainly take through to the technical working group, just around establishing perhaps guidelines, if you will, about codes about dress code. And of course, the critical part of that would be how that is enforced within the public service itself, that we don't turn a blind eye to it. But I think it's an incredibly important point, that you make, that we don't necessarily need to have a uniform that typifies us as the public service, but we certainly need to have a dress code that is befitting of public service, so that we take ourselves seriously and the citizens out there know that we take them seriously. Thank you.
Lastly, to member of the Public Service Commission, Moroko Maboa, covers the importance of constitutional values and principles.
Thank you, Dr. Moses. From my side, nothing really much except to thank the colleagues for being in attendance. But I just want to reiterate, the values, the constitutional values and principles, to remind ourselves that as public servants, as we serve, we must continuously remember that we need to align ourselves with the constitutional values and principles as they give us direction on how we do business, how we conduct ourselves as public servants, how we are supposed to make decisions as public servants, how we treat each other, as public servants, that we need to create an enabling environment that enables our fellow, colleagues to be the best that they can be within the work environment. And also how we as public service treat members of the public as our clients, and other government departments. My colleague Cameron, made an example. If you're not happy with insurance, you can go to Auto and General in terms of insurance. But Home Affairs, there's no other institution that is mandated to perform those kind of functions. So let's remind ourselves that as public servants, we need to serve wholeheartedly. As a public servant, you are appointed to serve. Being of service takes priority. higher than your own personal interests. And therefore we have to live, as in LIVE, live and demonstrate these constitutional values, because they are a guiding principle. There's a saying that unless you stand for something, you'll fall for anything that comes your way. These constitutional values and principles are what we should stand for as public servants. I like to use an analogy of a suit, a suit as in, this outfit that you wear. These constitutional values and principles, it's this suit that is this size, you have to fit in it. It cannot be expanded, to accommodate you. In other words, as public servants, it's not negotiable that, maybe you can, leave the constitutional values, maybe you've got an option not to. No. Consistently, we've got to comply and lead constitutional values and principles, because as I said, they are a guiding light that illuminates our path to a brighter future.
This brings us to the end of the Masterclass in Public Service Commission Constitutional Values and Principles, proudly brought to you by the DPSA. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the DPSA Batubili podcast, available now on both YouTube and Spotify, and soon coming on SoundCloud and Apple. If you're also a visual person, subscribe to our DPSA TV channel on YouTube at Department of Public Service and Administration, and stay in the know of what public servants in South Africa are up to. Be on the lookout for episode 4, a masterclass in business process management. Until then, this is Kamo signing off.